welcome everybody. Welcome Joseph from Aegis.net, and he's here to talk about following the bouncing ball, moving beyond FHIR server testing to testing clients in multi-actor scenarios.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming today. This is my first time speaking at DevDays, but I've been around for a while now. I'm a standards and specifications geek at Aegis.net, and I'm the test lead for the test suite for this big long name, which we call by many names, like HL7 Fast Security IG, or HL7 UDAP, or Sarah, or you pick. But whatever it is, it's profile over OAuth 2. And so there you go. It's a short talk, so I'm going to try and go quickly. So why are we here? Well, we're here when we test FHIR implementations. The low-hanging fruit is testing the server. We all know how to do that. You set up Postman, or you do a build script or something, and you throw a bunch of stuff at your server, and you get it back, and we're good to go. So that's well-trod territory. And this session is about the opposite of that. So if you have clients to test, and if you have multiple actors, or you have multi-step workflows that you need to test, how do you do that? There are some actual issues with doing that, and there are a lot of different approaches. So I put this little thing in here, but where you might say, but wait, I do test my client. I run it against Graham's server. I take it to connectathons. I run it through the paces, through some expected workflows. I might have a test mode where I will put every outgoing request through a validator, and I'll check it to see if it's valid against the FHIR validator. And that's good. That's all good stuff. So let's go a little deeper. So part of the reason that I'm here is that I got assigned this task of coming up with the test suite for HL7 UDAP. And it was like, it has all the edge cases in one IG, which is so much fun. So it's got FHIR transactions, it's got non-FHIR transactions, so that'd be the OAuth 2, which is RESTful JSON. It's got conformance and behavior requirements on client and server. It's got workflow requirements. It's got complexity. It's got signed JOTs. It's got all sorts of fun stuff. So like example, the client has to validate signed metadata that it gets back from the server, and the client and server negotiate. They have this negotiation dance through the workflow where the client discovers metadata about the server, then the client registers with its own metadata at the server, etc. So a lot of things that happen that you need to test. There are lots of servers and lots of clients. So the servers, we have a regular FHIR server, a resource server in OAuth speak. We have an OAuth authorization server. We have an IDP, an identity provider. And then the identity provider has its own OAuth authorization server. We have clients. We have our typical RESTful FHIR client. We have a RESTful OAuth client. You might think of those as different. They're often combined. We have a user agent, because some of the flows use the browser. And then we have an OAuth authorization server in one of the flows acts as a client. So it's like a three-actor dance. So we addressed this with a rigorous requirements analysis and test development process, and we were going to be testing clients, server, or both, or many combinations as systems under test. So part of our process is we look at the requirements, we analyze those, and we decide on a suite of tests. And in each test, we identify which of the actors are the systems under test, the SUTs. And so for like happy paths through a transaction, like your basic UDAP discovery, we'll have a happy path test where both the client and server are systems under test. And what that means is we can do something like take it to a connectathon and run it with a real client and a real server, and we can evaluate them both and see how they did. Now, we could also substitute the either side. If all we really want to do is test a server, we could plug in a test tool in place of that client and execute the same test and achieve the same thing, but we might choose to only evaluate one side. So that's where a lot of the stuff is, and that's where we do a lot of, the royal we, do a lot of our testing is in that area, that connectathon style testing, where we can run it against a real system, a real client, a real server, an RI, that sort of thing. Then we have other variations, one where the client is the test tool. I'm using this TT, just my convention, where the test tool is something that stands in for a real actor. So when the client's a test tool and server is system under test, you can start to test things that you couldn't test otherwise with regular systems. You might have legal variations on the request, things that your typical systems don't generate. Maybe it's some weird kind of date format. Maybe it's some esoteric claim in a JOT, something like that. You can also test invalid requests, like negative testing. You might have specific requests to drive specific conditional or just any kind of server behavior. So you have a particular test where the workflow is designed to drive the server into, say, a token expiration flow, something like that. And then in the other direction, you could have the client being the system under test, and the server is the test tool. And for that, you would do things like where you would have the client, you might have some conditional tests. The client only has to exercise if they've implemented some optional behavior. You might have, you want to see how the client deals with variations on the response. Invalid responses, how do they deal with that? You might check in the requirement I mentioned earlier in UDAP, you might want to say, let's have the client fetch server metadata and the signature not validate, right? And you want to make sure that the client is going to reject that server metadata because it's not secure. Finally, you might want to have specific responses that drive the client to do something, like the token expired. And so the client has to go and grab another access token, all right? So that's the basic idea. So we know that we want client and server to be able to be systems under test in the test cases that we have designed. So how are we going to do this? Well, TestScript, the TestScript resource, can handle this. And I should mention that was part of my requirements, was that I had to do this testing suite, but I had to use the TestScript resource. And TestScript can handle this. So you have this origin and destination. These are two different parts, excerpts. That's why they're boxed. So the origin and destination are both 0 to many. So you can leave them blank. And the convention that we have seen in test engines is that, an origin and destination are called that because FHIR doesn't have to be REST. You can use FHIR messaging. But when you're doing REST, then origin is the client and destination is the server. And as I said, if it's populated, the convention is that these are potential systems under test. So for example, in the Touchstone tool, if you define a test script and you define the origin and destination as being non-zero, then that means that Touchstone will allow you to select test systems and plug them into those roles in the test script when you create a test setup that you're going to execute. And then within the test scripts have operations, and so you execute an operations, and then they have asserts. So you do a get or a post, or it could be a FHIR get, it could be a RESTful get, and then you have asserts that you can do against the request and the response and the headers in the request and response, the body, the content type, all that stuff. So that's all fair game. The test script is pretty full-featured, right, to give you the ability to interrogate all this stuff. And another nice thing is being a FHIR resource. It's something that you can have a canonical instance of a test script that would be an official test for a particular IG. You can share them, you can host them, you can export them, etc. So you get all the goodness, the infrastructure that comes with having something as a FHIR resource. Okay. All right. So now you want to do some client and multi-actor testing. So you have to choose a process to do that in a testing engine, and we have some functions that we need to account for. Well, we need the actors, right? So we need the clients and the servers. We need some of them to be systems under test and some to be test tools. We need some way to evaluate, okay? That might be manual, might be inspection. And we need something to orchestrate, something to run the tests. So there are a lot of techniques, and we'll do the Q&A later, but for now, I want to do quick hands up. So the first technique is the one that we do at Connectathons, where you test systems under test manually against either other systems under test or against test tools. So if they're test tools, they could be RIs, simulators, mocks, what have you. And you have a test tool to simulate the client when the server is the system under test, et cetera. You might orchestrate it manually. So we do this at Connectathon. We say, here's the scenario for the track. Scenario 1, you do this, you send this message, you do this, and somebody looks at it. Or if you're at an IHE Connectathon, a monitor will look at that and give you a score, give you a grade, whether you did those things. If you've just got the systems that are being the client and server, you have to have some way of knowing what they said. So that might mean you have to dig into logs. They have to have some way of saying, well, what was the message? What did you get? Do you have access to that, right? If one of the sides is Postman, well, then you can see exactly what that is. But a lot of real clients and real servers don't necessarily have access to what the actual FHIR messages are or RESTful messages are. So that's one of the downsides of that. You're limited in evaluating based on what's available from those systems that are standing in for the clients and servers, or are. Okay, so the next technique is you do a test tool that combines some of these functions, an actor, orchestrator, and evaluator. If you're familiar with the Inferno tool, they do this to great success. They will orchestrate some server tests, they will simulate the client, and they'll get the answers back, and they'll evaluate the results. So that's a really tidy, wrap it up in a ball. That's a great way to test when you're doing this. When you're doing this method, advantage is you can automate this stuff, right? You can run a whole suite of tests real fast, and the systems under test can operate fairly normally. Okay, meaning you don't have to mess with them, and that's the goal when you're testing. Is you want to disturb the system under test the least, right? It's always a little bit of a trade-off, a little bit of Heisenberg principle there, but you want to disturb it the least, and so you can get the broadest coverage. Okay, other tools that do this. There is in my area of UDAP. There is a tool out there called the UDAP test tool, which does this on both sides. It will simulate the client to test your server, and it will simulate a server to test your client. And it combines the simulation with the evaluation, okay? So on this page, how many of you all test your clients using the first method, the Connectathon method or all right, cool. I should have asked how many are testing clients at all, right? All right. How many are using the second method? You have a purpose-built test tool. All right, good. All right, that's a sweet spot, right? You can get a lot of testing accomplished in that way. Now I want to talk about another method. This is the one that we ended up doing, and I'm calling it an evaluating intermediary. So it sits between clients and servers, and it separates the evaluation from the simulation, from the orchestration, and from the actors. Okay. Advantage is that it allows the client and server to be 5 minutes. It allows these to be independent and allows management of testing and results as a platform. So I have, I'm sorry, is that 5 minutes to the entire end, or I have to start my Q&A? 5 minutes to 5 minutes to Q&A, or 5 minutes? 5 minutes to lunch. Okay. So what I'm going to do, then is I'm going to jump ahead and I'm going to show you something real quick. This is a TestScript execution covering the UDAP tiered OAuth flow, and there are actually 3 clients in this, and something like 4 servers. Okay, you have a client app which is a RESTful client and a user agent. And in some cases, the RESTful client is actually running in the cloud, so they're on two machines. Then you have the data holder in the middle, acting as its own client as well as a server. And we have, oh, of course, I have that. And we have test execution where we actually captured this stuff. And you can see in here, you can see there are 3 different origins, 4 or so different destinations, and you can see that all this stuff was captured. And by using this technique of an evaluating intermediary, that kind of information can now be stored in a platform, and you can do data analysis on it, find out where the errors are, where people are messing up the IGs. So rather than me go right into my presentation, because we're in the Q&A part, I'll just ask now, do you have any questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my question is about when you're testing clients, sometimes when you're testing business workflows,
Right.
there will be instances where people will not implement it the same way exactly.
Right.
Maybe the request will be switched or something like that. Some may use transaction bundles, stuff like that. How do you intend to deal with that? What's your take on this?
Okay, it's a good question. And I would say there are two things about that. One is where, for example, some clients will bundle a bunch of workflow calls, and they'll do it all as right? If that's the issue, at least our platform supports that. You can run them with delays in between, or you can do them, just okay? So that can be tested. If the difference is that the clients do some implementation specific things differently, like the requirement is that the client display something to the user, and one displays it this way and one displays it that way, well, there are always going to be steps that need to be manually evaluated. And we put that, we use the warning in the warning thing in the TestScript resource to say, check this manually. Any other questions? Yeah, Cooper, or?
All right. So for that intermediary approach that you just described, is that essentially just like using a smart proxy that knows about, so you have to set up a proxy to say, like, when a client request comes in, you track it,
Yep.
and then you set it up to say, okay, for this ID or whatever, that routes to a server. So you do the setup step to say how to connect, and then it's just a proxy?
Yes, it's a proxy. And in my presentation, if you want to grab the slides, I talk about the advantages of proxy, and then I talk about 2 flavors of proxy, a passive and an active one. An active one would be rewriting URLs and re-signing JOTs and things along the way. The advantage of the active one is it does the least amount of interference with the systems under test. The disadvantage is you get less of the space that you can test, okay? We went the other way with a passive intermediary. And so the passive intermediary literally passes through, so the server gets what the client sent. And we can evaluate every part of that. The only downside is we have to do some tricks to make the routing work. But we've figured out a bunch of different ways to make that work as transparently as possible. We use like Etsy host modification and things like that, so that the client can run pretty much as normal. And then the messages just magically show up in the intermediary.
For the cardinality on the TestScript resource,
Yeah.
I noticed there was an optional or 0 to 1. Why is that not a requirement to be implemented for the origin and destination?
For the origin destination, it doesn't say in the description of the TestScript resource, but I think the way that it means is there's generally enough information in the TestScript that the test engine say were not populated, okay? If you don't populate origin, for example, Touchstone can look at the information and say, I'm expecting this operation and these attributes, and then it might make some assumptions, and it acts as the client. So that that's a convention, which is if it's not populated, it's saying the test engine has to be that simulator.
All right, thank you, everybody. That's all the time we have for questions, and thank you,
Thank you.
Joseph.
Thanks for coming.